before war becomes a physical reality, it has to be an idea first. It doesn't just spring out of the ground or fall out of the sky like the weather. Somebody has to think it, turn it over, give it enough attention to take root. Even a surprise ambush has to be planned by someone somewhere in advance. So, if war starts as a thought, the question worth asking is, where does that particular thought actually come from? So we're obviously talking about war today. I want to say up front, I'm probably not going to solve it in the next 9 minutes or so. Nobody has yet, but I think there's a smaller, honest, useful idea buried inside the impossible one of world peace, and that's worth digging for. People go to war because they feel threatened. They feel threatened because things they believe about who they are and what the world should look like get challenged, either through light questioning, someone existing differently, or an outright attack. But underneath that threat is something more basic, and that's the feeling of being separate, isolated. A self that has to be defended because it could end, because it's fragile. But that separateness isn't as real as it feels. We are all connected through other people, whether we notice it or not. Ideas move between us constantly, and individuals, single individuals, have shaped the thinking of entire populations without ever touching them physically. Borders and titles and property lines and opinions and judgments that make us feel separate are useful in a measurement sense, but they're not ultimate facts about reality any more than the difference between an inch and a centimeter is, like which is more real. So what happens when large groups of people take these measurements as their identity, as actual facts of reality? A person who feels at war with the world is going to raise a family that feels the same way. And they are going to form neighborhoods that will compete with other neighborhoods, and then cities have their rival cities, and nations war with nations. And it's the same fear replicated at every size. It's a fractal effect. And look at this in yourself. Like, don't you feel mostly at odds with the world, like most of the time? Don't feel like getting up. You don't feel like interacting with your family or your spouse or your roommates or whatever. There's too many people on the street, there's traffic, and then your own job, you've got your bosses and the corporate overlords and your coworkers that, some of them are lazy and some of them are overachievers making you look bad. And doesn't it feel like everyone is constantly in your way and interfering? What type of world do we expect is going to come with every single individual feeling at odds with every other individual? This notion that we are all interconnected is something that we're not really taught through culture, but it's been pointed out enough. I am obviously not the originator of this, but it hit for me in a very visceral way a number of years ago when I was on my way to work at an office job. The office job is important. That'll come back into play later. I know I talk about I work in bookstores all the time, but this was an office job. And I heard on the news on my way to work that a war that was currently in progress, had been grinding on for a while, was on the verge of escalating into something genuinely unthinkable. And I don't know why it was that particular story that hit me so hard and not some other one before or since, but it hit me really hard, and I had this very specific realization that we all contributed to this, that all of our collective actions are responsible for the state of the world as it is. Which means, in theory, that we could all contribute to it being different. And I think it was mostly just my feeling of total, despondent helplessness at this news story that pushed me towards that thought in the first place, because I wanted to believe there was something I could do about it. Here's where the office job comes in. It's the only office job I ever had, and I realized quite quickly there is a lot of downtime in office jobs. I spent the first part of my shift just writing these ideas down, and nobody noticed. My performance metrics did not suffer a jot. This idea I didn't invent. I was really drawn to the ideas of a philosopher named Jiddu Krishnamurti, who spent over 5 decades making this argument all over the world that we are all responsible. I've been reading and listening to him for a very long time, and I've also gone through long periods of distance from him, dropping him completely. I'm not trying to prop up some ideal guru that everyone needs to follow and read from. So a part of this argument that I find most useful is this notion of really seeing what's true without the distraction of the narratives around us. In the case of something with war, we need to see its threat. If you're just walking down the street talking to a friend, or more likely staring at your phone, and then you almost fall into a hole, what do? Like, you go, whoa, you flail, catch your balance, and you keep walking. You don't keep scrolling and fall in face first while wondering whatever your favorite pundit thinks about holes in the street. You will drown in that hole listening to everyone's opinions about holes in the street. You don't need a 5-step plan for not falling into a hole. You just see it and you don't fall in. Why don't we see the danger of our individual warlike psychology multiplied by everyone across the globe? In the same way, we would see ourselves almost falling off a cliff or falling into a hole. The question answers itself because there's obvious propagandistic machinations in place to prevent us from seeing that. But the real danger, the visceral danger of global annihilation should at some point break through. And so an obvious criticism with this framework, and especially the source material, Krishnamurti, who talked for over 50 years to enormous audiences all over the world, the state of the world in broad strokes hasn't really changed. So either he's wrong about the mechanism, that seeing clearly doesn't actually produce the tipping point he describes, or he's right about the mechanism, but it's simply outmatched by forces operating at a scale that no single voice, however clear, can move on its own. And I don't know which one of those is true. I'm not going to pretend I've resolved that issue because I haven't, and I'd rather leave it open than hand you like a tidy answer that I don't actually believe. So if we can't rely on the idea that enough individual clarity will guarantee a positive change, what is left that is worth doing? Here's where I landed on that, is that we should stop trying to justify the practice by its hoped-for effect on the entire world and judge it on its own terms instead. You can't verify whether you personally are moving the needle on global conflict. That math is permanently outside anyone's ability to check. What you can verify is much smaller. Whether you today fed the world a story of separateness or you didn't. That's the actual scale of your influence, and it's worth being honest about that scale rather than inflating it into wishful thinking, assuming that my one individual action will have this cosmic reach, and we also don't want to dismiss it as worthless just because it's so small. This is where I will kind of, unfortunately, have to veer into this like cliched advice that I used to replace with magical thinking, but I'm gonna take it a little further, so hopefully we'll escape the cliche in a bit. But we can notice the exact moment something like a driver, an online comment, or a headline flips in your head from simple irritation into this person, this group, this idea is the enemy. Notice when you label enemies. You don't have to stop it. You don't even have to write it down or anything, but you just notice the scene where it turns into a story. Because a story is a narrative which is not actually true. Reality itself is neutral. A lot of people give that advice, so I'm just repeating it now. The kind of wrinkle worth naming about Krishnamurti's talking about, why don't we see the danger, is because it sounds great in broad strokes, but the danger is different for everyone. In the same way that I don't know why that initial news story really hit me harder than anything before or since. We don't know what is going to be the catalyst for us. This mismatch is one of the engines of most political infighting. Why are you worried about this when you should be worried about that? It's one of the most reliable engines of division between people who otherwise will agree that something is wrong. You don't get to choose your catalyst or when it arrives. All you can really do is build the habit of paying attention so you're not entirely dependent on the world accidentally cracking you open once every few years. And this act of attention itself is a strength, because if you are paying attention, you are not reacting angrily. You are not reacting thoughtlessly. You are not adding to the problem. You are observing. Maybe you're not doing anything, but maybe doing something in a state of emotion is worse than doing absolutely nothing at all. I said at the start I wasn't going to solve this in 9 minutes or however long this video is, and then of course I spent the entire video trying to solve it anyway. This impulse, wanting the whole thing resolved right now, today, completely, neatly, packed away, that might actually be part of the same pattern this video's been describing the whole time. We want certainty and we want it immediately. And the slow, unglamorous, individual version of sorting out the war in your own heart doesn't satisfy certainty at all. That impatience is part of the small, honest practices, is why these small, honest practices get labeled as cliche and feel like they're not doing enough, even though they are the best tool we've actually got. A small, practical thing you can do beats the most lofty ideal that just sits around in your head. So I hope some of this resonated with you. It might not. The original version of this, I posted on an old channel I had years ago. This one video was the one that never had any views whatsoever, so maybe it's not as wide-ranging a topic as I think it is. But I hope some of this landed for you, and that it could at least float the notion that you have a little more autonomy over your inner state than you think. And if that is true, it is worth exploring, and that you are a source of anything. And if you make that source as positive as possible, that's probably beneficial for humanity as a whole. All right? Thanks.